Okay, perfect. Okay, here I am again. Where was I now? Now I'm looking at this beautiful photo of Lee Webster. Our guest will be Lee Webster. She is the Director of New Hampshire Funeral Resources, Education, and Advocacy, former President of the National Home Funeral Alliance, and a former Director and Educational Consultant and Development for the Green Burial Council. She's also served on the NHPCO, which is the National Hospital Palliative Care Organization, End-of-Life Doula Council, and is currently serving on the National End-of-Life Doula Alliance and the Conservation Burial Alliance as a founding organizer. Hey, this woman's busy. She's a writer, researcher, teacher, and frequent speaker on the benefits of home funerals and green burial throughout the U.S. Beautiful, and I could say quite a bit more about her, but let's talk to her. I think that'd be more fun right now. First of all, thank you so much for joining me, our listening audience of tens or more. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Fody. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no, really glad to have you. Maybe a good place to start would be, how in the world did you get involved in any of this crazy death stuff? You must be like a totally depressed, morbid person that just thinks about death.
I'm just terrible. Just terrible.
It shows on your face. You can't hide it.
Exactly.
I can see most of your teeth in your smile.
Exactly. Well, I was thinking about this, anticipating this question, and I thought, I'm going to take you right back to the beginning. I grew up in a little town outside of Montpelier, Vermont, with those little one-room schoolhouses where my, very Republican Vermont at the time, a George Aiken Republican, and in fact, his daughter was the teacher who taught me how to write. But the reason I'm telling you the story is that my parents were cemetery commissioners in the town, and the town that I lived in was right next to Goddard College, where they were on a trimester system in the late 60s, and so that meant that they had students in school in the summer, and they were running a community garden right next to the cemetery, one of the cemeteries that my parents were overseeing. And my folks noticed that the manager of that cemetery was spending an inordinate amount of time at that particular cemetery. So they threw all of us kids in the car one Saturday afternoon and drove us over to the cemetery to find out why he was spending so much time there. And what we discovered was that the students were working in the garden adjacent to the cemetery, wearing only their boots and headscarves. And that's when I discovered that really fun things happen in cemeteries. So that was the beginning of my trip down into cemetery world.
Life and death. I love that as a beginning. The gardens and the cemetery. Wow, what a beautiful thing.
Exactly. And the nudity really helped too, because that kind of changed the perspective of a little Vermont girl. So I went from that.
Not to mention the cemetery manager.
Well, he was pretty excited about it as well, apparently. So, but I spent my whole childhood listening to them, trying to figure out where all the bodies were buried, and I was very interested in conservation work, and I went into hospice when I was very young. When I had my daughter was just a year old, I was still nursing at the time. So
when you say you went into hospice, what does that mean?
I trained as a volunteer very early on. I started in bereavement, and then I went on to respite work, and now I run programs with people teaching or assisting families as volunteers with funeral planning, basically, alerting them to what all their options are. So all of that kind of converged for me in 2007 when Mark Harris wrote his book Grave Matters, and I was driving to my fun job teaching cross country skiing, and I heard an interview with him on NPR, and I just pulled the car over, listened to the whole thing, jotted down the book, and he went home, ordered it, read it, and a couple of weeks later was in Sebastopol, California with Jerry Grace Lyons of final passages, learning how to be a home funeral guide.
A dear friend who comes to our trainings.
Absolutely, yeah, and really someone who's just been an enormous influence on all of us.
Yeah,
Obviously.
not just a good friend, but at the forefront of the home funeral movement in this country.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's where I got really immersed in the idea of the home funeral piece, because it connected to the hospice piece that brings us through the whole full continuum of care into the green burial world. So it just seemed to me like in order to be effective as an advocate, which I knew right away was my role, that I needed to understand all of the pieces and parts, including all the sort of standard funeral industry, cemetery business, all that kind of stuff, in order to figure out how we're going to make changes to all of this in a system that's very broken.
Say a bit about what's broken about it.
Yeah,
I talk about it all the time, but I want to hear you describe it in your words.
Yeah, we could talk about it endlessly. Excuse me, I'm feeling a bit cold.
You're gonna die,
Yeah, this is just going to kill me. I'm going to wait for it, though. Essentially, what I see as broken is the whole social fabric of the way that we deal with this.
You want a drink of water?
Yes, sorry.
I can't give you one, but don't be sorry. Have a drink. I wish I could just hand you one through the computer screen.
I've got it here, but it's not helping. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. You're human. We're all human. I think it's getting hard to tell. I think we're gonna have to prove it before.
I'm so sorry.
Don't worry about
it. I recently wrote a piece for the Wake Forest Law Review that had to do with social justice and funerals. And it lays out an awful lot of the ways that we are disenfranchised from our own death experiences and our own caring for our own death, our own dead, because of the way that the system has been set up and the way it's been professionalized. So
say a little bit about what you mean by that. Take your time.
Yeah, essentially the funeral industry has been growing since its inception, where the NFDA, the National Funeral Directors Alliance or Association, started in 1898, I think, and then got a really swift boot around the 1930s, particularly when Wilbert Haas started the Wilbert Company after a nice trip to Tutankhamun's grave or tomb in Egypt. And he had this wow idea about vaults, creating vaults to protect people and to protect us from dead people, because, suddenly, instead of being an average dead person in your home, they're suddenly infectious and dangerous and all of those things. So, all of that was happening around the turn of the century. And it just grew and grew and grew, and it's an enormous, multi-billion-dollar industry now.
The American way.
The American way, yeah.
I wonder if most people don't recognize what huge billion-dollar industries these are, and that it didn't always be the case.
Exactly.
We used to do it in our home, of course.
Well, and in my world here in New England, it wasn't that unusual for people to continue to do it right up into the 1950s. But then things really took a turn and became very professionalized, to the point now where even going to a state office of vital statistics, I run into the secretary for the head of it, who says to me that it's not legal to do it yourself. You have to embalm bodies. That's the law, and of course it's not the law in any state.
Right.
And neither is.
Wait. Let's stop. Let's not run past that very important thing, that it's not legal in any state where embalming is required. Very important. Most people don't know that.
Right. Most people think it absolutely has to be done, and of course it doesn't. It's a cosmetic procedure that again, back to the social
It's
justice.
more, of course, you know, it's more than a cosmetic procedure. It's a very barbaric practice in terms of what happens to the body.
Right, highly invasive, and one of the things that I particularly am interested in around all of this are socioeconomic issues, racial issues, anything having to do with up and down around this. And when you look at embalming is something that we do. It lasts a couple of weeks to preserve the body so that it can be viewed publicly in a funeral home. It's really not. It doesn't have any other use. And it's very dangerous for the embalmers. But it's specifically targeted to Caucasian Christians. There's, we're not crossing lines. We're not crossing, the fact that the African American community has bought into this very heavily, particularly in the South, and particularly into big, expensive funerals, is really a testament to the veracity of the marketing wing of the funeral industry.
Which feeds what's come to be a massive denial of death itself.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's putting people into huge debt, tremendous amount of debt, and it just, none of it makes any sense when you really start thinking about it. It's just that we've come to believe these things. And I just don't, my whole role, I think, in all of this work is to just remove some of these myths and try to knock down some of the things that just don't logically make sense.
I'm Bodie B. This is Death Tracks. I'm speaking with Lee Webster, former head of the National Home Funeral Alliance, and helped facilitate as part of the Green Burial Council and many other things in this, I would call a movement to basically reclaim something we've given away. So speaking with Lee, so you touched on a little bit the social, economic implications, and you mentioned one of the economic implications is how expensive it is now to die, and how expensive it is for a family to put on a real funeral. It's absurd, again, discriminating against poor people. But speak a little bit about what you see as some of the social implications in terms of what's happened in kind of giving over something to industry and business and institutions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge part of this, is that we've and the thing is, we've done it to ourselves. It's sort of that pattern of affluence over a period of time where, at the turn of the century, we were professionalizing. There was industrialization. Everybody wanted to go to the office. They weren't staying at the farm. People were dying in hospitals instead of homes. All of those things were happening. And one of the main pushes of that was to see what the wealthy people were doing and emulate that. And that was what happened. Very wealthy people could afford funerals, outside, produced funerals, rather than doing them themselves. And so we bought into it. We just agreed to it. We bought into the myth of the infectious body and the myth of the helpless mourner. That
what's the myth? Wait. What's the myth of the infectious body? Tell us.
That they're dangerous. They're dangerous to us, and it's the whole zombie thing. I mean, that's part of why we buy vaults, right? We're trying to protect ourselves from them and protect them from the elements, because they're going to be there forever and ever, which is an outright lie. But the myth that really gets me the most, and to come back to your point, is the helpless mourner. The idea that we bought hook, line, and sinker, that we just didn't have the strength and the ability to care for our dead. We just couldn't face touching their bodies, and we just couldn't face having them in the house for longer. When they were dead, they were leaving. And that's not what makes sense to us, both personally. In experiencing death, we need to be in it. We need to smell it. We need to see it. We need to touch it. We need to absorb it in every way we can.
Why? Tell me in your words why we need that.
I think we need that in order to integrate death, our own personal view of death. I mean, every time we experience someone else's death, we're getting closer to our own, right? And it's part of our acceptance process to participate in it and practice as many times as we can. And that's the personal piece. The social piece for me is that funerals, the whole act of caring for the dead, no matter whether you go to a church or you stay home or you go to a bar and drink up, it's about building community around the loss of that person who has died. And we lose that when we move to options like direct cremation or immediate burial, where people don't get together, they don't acknowledge the death, they don't weep together, they don't participate in any way. The idea of closed caskets years ago was already a huge distance. Now, if somebody dies, you pick up the phone, the body's removed, you get them back in a box that says temporary container so that you'll purchase a real one. And we've lost it. We've just lost our connection to all of it. And
I want to jump in here because I talk about that very piece, that if our habituated muscle is, if somebody dies, to immediately call a funeral home to take that body away, and which is what most people do. That's the muscle we habituated to, and maybe we're trained to, marketed to. And then the next time we see that person, it's either in that temporary container box, or we see them embalmed looking somewhat like how they looked in real life. And that I talk about that break between when the person died and then how we next see it is incredibly detrimental to allowing our grief and to participating in what is so essential to life and what has been so essential to life from the beginning of life, which is still practiced in so many countries and cultures in the world, that it's a normal, beautiful thing not to be immediately sent off and made invisible.
Well, I think that's a huge point here. And this is a big one for me, because that's liminal space. That time between the death and disposition for me is that moment where everything needs to stop. And it's just, it's a symptom. It's just another symptom of how fast we're going to nowhere. And the fact that we're not willing to take that time and just stop and say, this is it. This is what I'm doing right now. And I'm just going to stop. I'm turning the TV off. I'm turning my phone off. I'm going to be here. Whether I want to be sitting right next to a dead person or not, I have the option of moving in and out. And that's a big piece of the grief pattern too. This is what I notice about it, is that people will feel compelled to walk in and be beside the body. And then they'll feel the need to move on, go back into their life, or go out into another room with their family, or out to church, or to wherever it is they might need to go. This mimics the waves of grief for me, where grief comes and it washes over you and it overwhelms you, and then it waves back again. And then the next, before you know it, it's kind of hit you again. And I think that again, it's practice. It's practice being with a dead body over a period of time to feel that ebb and flow, because death isn't this just boom, it's done. I can explain that very well from my own history. When my dad died, my mom my dad was out of the house in 45 minutes. And he was 2 streets over on a metal table in the cold. And I just laid there awake all night thinking about how much I wish he were downstairs so I could just go talk to him and just go sit with him. And I didn't have that, but it was important to her. He was gone. Well, when she died just a year ago, this last month, in my home, and I had her here, I was able to move in and out as the spirit moved me. And it was extraordinary. Now, I had my siblings with me who did everything they could not to walk in that room. So I really pointed out that, the difference between those of us who have become who've put ourselves in a position to reacquaint ourselves with the reality of death in our lives, and those who are still pretending it isn't there, or that if it is, we're just going to find a way not to participate.
The same thing happened. I went to see my mom after she died, and my brother and sister weren't willing to be in the room for more than a few moments around her body. I guess I've been thinking lately that death might be the ultimate insult to us particular kind of humans that think we're somehow above and beyond the laws of nature. And people who are paying attention recognize, no, we are not above and beyond and immune to the laws of nature. We are we are nature, and death might be that ultimate insult that even we have to die. And to see that is a beautiful thing.
Exactly.
Of course, and
Very humbling.
you and I also know how it changes your life.
Exactly. Well, and I find that just doing this work, I mean, it's one thing to be doing this work when you're working with families, you know, and the dying, which I've done pretty much all my life, you know, off and on in different capacities. But what I find now as an advocate, trying to teach other people about this and get them to start paying attention and then start to really participate in it, is that it's just as humbling on a day-to-day basis to be trying to explain why it's important to pay attention. Because you are, I mean, as you said earlier, you know, do I spend all my time being depressed and miserable? Never. But I also am I guess I'm in deep gratitude every day that that this is part of my life, that I'm able to communicate this to people who are receptive, and some people who aren't, but are getting there. And being able to do that gives me the opportunity then to acknowledge it on a daily basis and get more and more familiar with it. You know, a lot of, you know, in the helping professions, we're always trying to think what is it that we're doing to get out of it ourselves. And, you know, in this work, because it's a burgeoning field of, you know, the whole idea of, I guess, alternative, I prefer to think of it as traditional.
Exactly.
But you know, there is a lot, because it's new, because there aren't that many people in it. There's a lot of the cult of celebrity and the cult of personality. Mm-hmm. And I try to really just ignore that stuff and just go with that. Like, how can I make an impact today? Mm-hmm. And you know, be cognizant throughout the whole thing of you know, where I sit in that, and you know, what are the motives for my work? What's the reach of my work? What is it that I'm trying to really accomplish? And I find in most of this work, we think of death as being a very lonely thing, right? We die alone. No matter how many people are standing around the bed, we're on
a solo journey.
The guy doing it, right? And in this work of trying to acknowledge that and honor that and help other people come to that recognition and get comfortable with it, we have to form partnerships, and we have to you know, create more community around it. I think that's the key, going to be the key to our reclaiming these rights, and not just rights, but just the humanity of it all. We have to come back to understanding what it is before we can understand why it is. If we spend our whole life wondering why we die, we've missed the boat. You know?
I'm Bodie B. This is Death Tracks on KEKU 88.5 FM, streaming live on kekufm.org. I'm speaking with Lee Webster, the president of the New Hampshire Funeral Resources, Education, and Advocacy. She's the former president of the National Home Funeral Alliance and the former director and educational consultant and development for the Green Burial Council. She's also served on the National Hospital and Palliative Care Organization and the End of Life Doula Council, and is currently serving on the National End of Life Doula Alliance and the Conservation Burial Alliance as a founding organizer. She's a writer, researcher, teacher, and frequent speaker on the benefits of home funerals and green burials throughout the United States. I got to actually meet her. I knew of her, seen quite a bit about what she's up to, but I got to meet her in New York City a few months ago and was super thrilled to meet Lee Webster. I'm just so respectful and honoring and appreciative of how much she does some of the in the trenches work. I have so much respect for that. I try to stay on the edge of the trenches, but I end up in them, that's for sure. Um, I was thinking about, while you were speaking, that one of the things that showed up for me was how this is so connected to our fear of grieving and our illiteracy really around grieving. I guess about what I see is the fear of losing control, and not know, and thinking we'll drown in that grieving. And I was saying last night at this group I lead that I've never seen anyone drown, but I've seen so many people with unresolved grief that's stuck in their bodies and their unwillingness to do anything to help it move. And given that congestive heart failure is the number one cause of death in this country, clearly there's a connection between all those feelings, emotions, energies that are stuck somewhere, and maybe in our heart itself, congesting our very heart. So love to hear some more from you about it. Great stuff. And I'm so appreciative again what you're doing.
Well, thank you. It was equal pleasure, by the way, to finally meet you. The chances of getting to Hawaii from New Hampshire are pretty slim in my world these days. So I was glad you came halfway, more than halfway.
Actually offer you to come to our April doula training as my guest.
Oh, then I might have to make it to Hawaii.
Okay, good.
That sounds pretty good to me.
That is an invitation to come as my guest in April.
Well, wonderful. That's pretty great. I did have a thought when you were talking about the grief piece, and I think there's a second element to why we resisted so much. Part of that is the social pressure that's been placed on us by the media, and by media I mean movies and TV shows and all of the things that now teach us how to behave socially. And we only have like two different ways of looking at that, I think. One is that you have a stiff upper lip, or that you completely dissolve. So it goes back to that myth of the helpless mourner. Everybody's question always is, how's she holding up? And, like every TV show, there are only two ways. She's either flat out in bed while the reception's going on in her own home, or she's stoic and tough, and everybody's thinking she's a real nasty woman. So we haven't given ourselves choices on how to behave.
What a good point.
We don't know how to behave anymore. We don't have anyone who's modeled for us what it really, really looks like and feels like. And there's this overarching self-consciousness around it that just mirrors everything else about the standard conventional funeral process for me. It's all very self-conscious. There's very little letting go and just feeling it and being in the moment and letting it move you. And nothing gets you to that other than actually experiencing it. That's the other piece. And if we don't allow ourselves to keep our loved ones home, even for a few hours, if we don't allow ourselves to be with them while they're dying, and then I know there are a lot of circumstances where it's not possible to do either, but for the most part, it's a choice. And the more people who understand that they have a choice, the more people are going to opt in, I think. And they're going to be eyes wide open. We want to be, one of the big problems I have with all of this is that it's romanticized so much. That's the flip side of home funerals and green burials, is that, and also hospice work and end of life doula work, is that we're, everybody's having a beautiful death in their beautiful room. And, the other day I was at the University of Vermont. We were with a doula training there through the Larner School of Medicine. And Francesca Arnoldi, who runs that program, had asked everyone in the group to imagine the room that they plan to die in, and what does it look like, and what does it feel like? One of those exercises like writing your own obituary. And I immediately thought, well, all I can see is the steering wheel because I've just dropped another M&M peanut on the floor while I'm driving.
No, don't go that way. Don't do it.
I'm pretty sure.
I know someone who did go that way, picking up the cassette tape they dropped on the car.
Yeah.
Don't do that, Lee.
But you know,
Not M&Ms anyway.
yeah, exactly. But you know, if we spend our whole lives either ignoring it or romanticizing it, we're still not there. We're still not present for
That's
it.
so important. I love that you just said.
Yeah, let's be real about it, and you know, and have to necessarily be you know, Harold and Maude running after the, you know, whatever death is happening in your area every time it happens.
At least
But
I think I encourage people to do that at least for a little while. Go all the way to the other end of the pendulum.
Yeah, that would be pretty good. I have to say, I always feel badly when I think that people aren't going to show up at funerals. I always think maybe I should just step in and then see if I can flesh it out. But
That's what you hear, though, right? I hope people show up at my funeral, kind of thing. When they're at a funeral, I hear people say that, you know.
Yeah.
And that speaks to the larger issue of what is community and how loneliness is really an epidemic in this country, and the fear of dying alone, and the fear of nobody showing up, and the fear of not being remembered. Huge, right? Huge.
Exactly. And again, the system that's in place right now just contributes to that, maybe even created it in a lot of ways. And I don't mean to be just, you know, saying anything negative about funeral directors. My belief is that most funeral directors are in the business because their families have been in it. It's a family honor that's often passed down generation to generation. There's tremendous burnout. There's tremendous alcoholism. There's Parkinson's disease. I mean, there's a lot of reasons not to become a funeral director. But I don't want to take away from the integrity that most of them bring to this profession. The fact is, though, there are just way too many of them. They can't support, you know, that they're just, the supply and demand is so out of whack. And the more we take it back, whether we do it by ourselves or whether we have a funeral director who is willing to, and, you know, and supportive of more participation from the family.
Well, it needs to come out of the world of business and commerce and needing to make money as a funeral director in the death business. To me, that's the core problem, that it's still a money game. I mean, here we are with the only nonprofit funeral home in the state of Hawaii. We're an anomaly that we're not in it for the money. And of course, how many people have told stories about going into a funeral home and they're grieving and they're in shock, and they end up, which is a lousy place to make a business decision, and then they're in shock by how much money they just spent and don't understand how it happened, and how many lousy funeral home stories there are around feeling taken advantage of, on and on, right? And that's the impression, right? Hospice has a fabulous impression. But funeral homes, I mean, hospice has a great reputation. Right? Funeral homes have a horrible reputation, and often well-deserved. You know, how to transform that whole, you know, that again, we're talking about cultural shift here.
Right. And that's another rant that I'm happy to go on is the relationship between funeral directors and hospice. Because you have to remember that, you know, 20, 30 years ago, hospice was just starting out. They had to fight really hard to get that credibility in the community. One of the ways that, and yet they have, right? Hospice has a pretty good reputation. I mean, there's still people who think that, you know, the minute you sign up, it's the death warrant, and they're missing the point here.
I think there are going to be people that always are going to think that hospice is the kiss of death, and they're out to kill you.
But
not true.
Probably this, right? Exactly. These are the people who are trying to help you manage the last of your life in the best way possible. But you tie that then to the funeral industry, which, as you say, has a bad rap, mainly from the 1960s and so on. But here's what's happening: the relationship between funeral directors and for funeral directors to kind of clean up their act and get a better public persona, given that they can't really advertise, right? What are funeral directors going to do? When you die, I'm your guy. That's my phrase.
I do things like that. I have these
Well,
stop.
that would work for you, but I don't know about the three-piece suit guy down my street here, if it would work around here. But what they've done, what the funeral industry has done.
Wait a minute. When you die, I'm your guy. I think I can do something with that.
It's pretty good. But what they've done is set themselves up as sponsors of hospices. Okay, and this is one of those,
Meaning
those
what? Meaning
social
what?
justice issues for me.
Meaning what?
Many funeral directors financially sponsor their local hospice. Okay?
How do they do that? What does that look like?
Well, they'll do fundraisers for the hospice. They'll have hospice auxiliary groups, and they'll be the presidents of them, or they'll support them in whatever way.
That sounds like a funny relationship.
It's a real conflict of interest, and yet it's very common, and hospices don't want to touch this because it's very lucrative and they need the help. I mean, hospices need money. Mm-hmm. They don't make a lot of money. So, and whether people know it or not, there are, for-profit hospices, and then there are not for profit, and they're ones that are run by the local.
You can't hardly tell the difference.
Well, they can tell the difference because of the amount of money that comes in and how many nurses and service support people they're able to keep on staff, which then directly affects the amount of service and time that they can spend with patients, which is pretty minimal in a lot of places. I mean, where I live in a rural community, but my hospice manages 14 towns, which goes up into 3 different counties all around us. So it's a problem, having enough money to manage this and have enough time. So funeral directors who are making a lot of money, who want to then support it, so that they have this public view, as being, sympathetic. It doesn't quite look like ambulance chasing.
It looks a lot like ambulance chasing.
But it does to me too. And this is a problem. This is one of those problems that's out there. At the same time, how else will funeral directors, given the intense competition between them for bodies, especially as the cremation rate rises? I don't know what it is in Hawaii right now. It's about 70% here in New Hampshire.
It's about 70 to 80% here in Hawaii, to a large degree, because we have such a large Oriental population here. And
so used to it, yes, right? Because Japan is an island, and all that. Yeah,
a lot of Asians here.
Yeah, well, here's the other thing. I've done a significant amount of research on the socioeconomic questions that come up about our Americans' funeral choices. And what I've come to is just mapping out all the places, all the states in the country, and their median incomes, their education levels, and various other types of questions. And if you look at the maps and you overlay them, it's very, very clear that the people who have the highest education, who earn the most money, are the ones who choose the cheapest funeral options. The people who have the least education, have no money to support this, are purchasing $20,000, $30,000, and $40,000 funerals, big ones, where if they own a home to begin with, if they're lucky enough to, they're going to remortgage. Just, it's unbelievable. GoFundMe projects are crazy.
I'm interested in hearing your take on that very thing, because there's some cultures around the world where ancient cultures, African cultures, Indonesian cultures that I've looked into, where they will, mortgage the house and borrow everything they can borrow and put on the most elaborate, often 2-week-long funeral, et cetera, and be in debt for the rest of their lives to pay for what's so important for them to do. So now you say, the rich white folk here do the opposite.
That's right.
Maybe because they're so smart and wanting to do the, maybe they're the most disconnected. But I'm interested to hear your take on it.
I can't prove that, but I have to say that is kind of where I come from. And given that I'm one of those, New England being one of those places with high income, high education, very, very white population, these are exactly the people who are choosing the least expensive option because, and they are the people who are just saying, oh, okay, well, they're dead, so bye-bye.
Here's another piece. Here's another piece to that. I think that's playing out is the average American moves every 5 years, and you would think, who are those people that are moving every 5 years? The more intelligent people, right? And oftentimes that's in general, a majority of that is the wealthy white people who have more education, right? And that the poorer people are the people who have lived in the same place maybe their whole lives. And those are the very people that actually may more likely to have a relationship with where their dead are. Whereas so many of us so many of us white folks have moved so many times that we don't know where our people are buried and have lost any sense of the value of a relationship to knowing where our people are and visiting those places. And clearly, I think that's one of the things that has fed the cremation boom.
Well, and I think the word investment is what we're looking for here in all of its meanings, right? We're either, when you look at people in the southern tier of the country, you're right. They probably grew up there. They're all their relatives are there. Everybody's buried there. Everybody still lives there. Yes, they're going to throw a lot of money at this because it is an investment in their culture, in their family, in their social, in the entire fabric of their social world. That makes sense. For those who are more peripatetic, I guess, and moving around all the time, and they're not invested in where they are. I can just, you wake up one day and go, okay, I could just as easily live 3 towns over. It wouldn't make a difference. That's a big change in the way that we perceive our place in the world, our sense of place, which is really critical when we start talking about burial specifically. Sense of place is like the number one thing we need to be concerned about. It's probably the last thing that people talk about.
That's fascinating that you bring that up because that's a whole conversation in itself. Because what are we talking about? We're talking about homelessness. That we on the whole are homeless people because of what you just described so well, no longer having a sense of place. We don't know where our people are buried. We don't have we're not rooted to that very place and the trees and the wildlife, etc. We are homeless. Well, I don't feel that way, but I think to a large degree our culture is homeless.
Well, it's part of our search, isn't it? I mean, I think that's part of what we're thinking about now. So we're spending a lot less time thinking about the ancestors. We're thinking more about our own a sense of belonging, and there's that separation now between those two thoughts.
And then on top of that, so then what do we hear at the bedside? How often do we hear grandma's going home? And I understand the sentiment about what is meant by that, but doesn't it also point to that we're not home here, that we're not home here now on this earth, right where we live?
Right. And, that's so funny you bring that up because I was just thinking about this as I was, recalling my mom's death here. One of my sisters was here during the time that she was actively dying, and Mom kept on talking about, oh, I'm so glad I'm going to be going home. I just want to go home. And I, of course, understood it for what she was really saying. And my sister kept on saying, do you mean Montpelier? Do you mean, she kept naming all these places, the camp on the lake? Do you mean, and she was like drilling my mom. I mean, really, really trying to pound it out of her. It was pretty funny, but it was just classic, again, that schism that we have, even in our own families, of understanding what all of this means and why we need to be paying attention to it. There's one other thing I wanted to mention too that came up earlier when you were talking about other cultures spending a lot of money on their funerals. Back in the day, there wasn't money involved. There might have been other types of things, barter
Right,
and so
right,
on, but it
right.
was important. But yeah, the idea that there's a price tag on this, that type of investment is kind of crazy, because what's the payback on an investment like that?
Again, you pointed to it. It's their culture, it's their community, it's that very investment of investing their lives into their community. And I was going to come back to this. It plays a part in this home funeral. I wanted to come back to, because what I immediately discovered was how your dying wasn't just for yourself, and your death wasn't just for yourself. When now I've seen generations that will now be teaching their generations that, when children are part of a home funeral and grow up having had those experiences, it changes their relationship to death. And I'm a big believer that when your relationship with death is changed, so is your relationship to life. And so getting to see that this is what you were talking about, the social implications and effects, you see how generations can experience healing and positivity through participating in the dying and the death.
Right. And I have to say that's one of the things about the Southern culture around funerals that I still find really compelling, is that there is still a lot of participation, despite the fact that they're spending way too much money. I mean, the first rule of being a good consumer is not consuming, right? So, finding ways to not consume. And
Wait a
still,
minute. It's Christmas time. Did you say a good consumer is one
I
that doesn't
did.
consume? Boy, I'm with you, Lee. I think,
did.
wow, that's a conversation itself in terms of how we're eating the world to fill
Yeah.
something that can never be fed by buying stuff, whatever the stuff is.
Well, when people are surprised when I tell them I had to purchase a cremation for my mom. That's what she wanted. So I had to buy that, but I didn't spend any other money for her funeral.
And how
Not
much is a cremation in your part of the world?
I had my own cremation container because I keep an attic full of them, to my husband's dismay. But it cost $350.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So, it wasn't
Amazing because it's
thought.
amazing because the lowest price I've seen in Hawaii is $1,500.
But does that include the non-declinable fee?
What's the non-declinable fee?
Funeral directors are allowed by the for the Federal Trade Commission to charge any amount of money they want to, called a non-declinable fee. That it basically is you picking up the phone and hiring them, and it's what they use to pay for overhead and keeping the lights on.
Oh, sure, the basic fee,
And
yes.
that money is spent also for them to do their job, to file the paperwork and to.
That's included. That's included in the $1,500.
Right. See, and all I had to pay for was the actual fossil fuel of burning. That's what I paid for.
Uh-huh.
And it's very rare to be able to do that. Again, and we go back to the social justice issue. That has to do with access. The fact that average Americans don't have access to a simple process and product like cremation. Can I go and buy a cremation? If I've taken care of all the paperwork myself, if I'm driving mom in the back of the Prius, if I'm, tied everything up in nice little bows, why can't I go to a place of business and say, here's everything you need. I'd like to pay you for your service. We don't have access normally to that, right? I'm very fortunate because I live close enough to a nonprofit crematory. And that's very unusual. So the fact that
did you drive your mom in the back of the Prius?
We did. Yep.
Did you prop her up?
Singing with James Taylor's newest album all the way. And by the way, every song is either about baseball or death. Just at least it is driving your mom in the back.
Was she propped up? Was she sitting in the back seat or what?
Nope, she was relaxing. Yeah, it's very
way to go. Mom gets to go last ride in her daughter's electric car.
That's right. She had great, exactly. Me and my Lisa Lou whatever name glasses. but anyway, it was a great time, and really meaningful to my family. That was good stuff. But the fact is, I was lucky because the system here is that I can file my own paperwork. I don't have to hire someone for thousands of dollars to fill out a form that I have to tell them what goes on it.
You can act as your own funeral director in Vermont or New Hampshire, where you are?
You can, there are only 9 states that require in some way or another that you hire a funeral director. And some of it's for the paperwork, some of it's for the transportation, some of it's for things like babysitting. In New York, you have to hire a funeral director to watch the body go in the ground or into the crematory retort. If that's not government overreach, I don't know what is. But basically here and in all the other 41 states, the family can do this themselves. If, and the question is, do you have access to it? Because it makes sense that there is an electronic death system where when someone dies, all of the information about their death goes into this basic database and is then transferred out. It's used for statistical purposes.
That's what they have here in Hawaii, right? And in fact, Hawaii is one of those states where anyone can do the paperwork, but they just the Department of Health, the Vital Statistics branch, discourages it. They want you to use a funeral home so that it's easier for them, because then it's the electronic filing system. So they discourage it big time here, even though, and they sure don't publicize the fact that anyone can do it.
Oh, for sure.
They discourage it, right?
Yeah, for sure. We just had that problem in Vermont where we had all this wonderful information and somebody decided that the public didn't need to know it and took it off. So we've had to fight to get it put back on their website.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing. Some of it's through ignorance, because there are people who just plain believe that, funeral directors are like doctors and lawyers. And of course they aren't. They have no, legal or medical authority over anybody. But it's just what we've been brought to believe. But the fact that people think they don't have access to taking care of their own paperwork, think that they don't, that they're committing a crime if they cross state lines with a dead body in the back. It's crazy to me that we think this way. I understand why we do. But if you say to people, okay, well, you're worried about crossing state lines. When's the last time you got stopped at the border? And people go, never. No, there's never been ever anybody at the border between, contiguous. And what are you, crazy? And I go, no, I'm not crazy, but you're crazy. you think they're looking for dead bodies in your trunk. So, we just become accustomed to this way of thinking that we have to hire it out to an authority. Right. And that really comes back to the very, very beginning. I remember being in Boston at a training with Beth Knox from Crossings, Caring for Ironic Death. And it's the first time I had met Beth, and it was absolutely wonderful. But I did take the opportunity as we went around the room to say why we wanted to do this work. My answer was because I don't want Big Brother telling me what to do. And the reason I mentioned that I grew up in a very Republican state is the fact that, and I've had this conversation with very ardent Republicans that
darn, there still are some.
And well, there's in Vermont, the ones that I grew up with are now called Democrats, so it's a whole different world. But I've talked to them about this and just said, you need to understand we're not on the opposite side when it comes to this. Republicans and Democrats, or however you see the world, or however you see the law in the United States. The fact is that as human beings, we have the right to care for our own dead without governmental influence or interference.
Beautiful.
And
that's what I love about the death thing. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican or what color you are.
Why are they, why in the world would anyone, unless it was in your own personal business interests, want to create laws that impede families from being able to care for their own dead?
What about all those funeral directors that'll go out of business?
That's where it comes from. Right. It's a $20 billion a year industry if you add the cemetery industry along with it.
Oh, and the casket making industry is another billion-dollar industry.
Yeah, enormous amount of money. It's a huge lobby. And yes, they're going to protect their interests as much as they can, particularly since there's just not enough dead bodies out there making them enough money per body. So it comes down to money that way. If we take our back, we take the responsibility back, we take all of the joys and sorrows of caring for our own, then it is going to have a major impact on their industry, but more importantly, on our entire culture. I just see this feeding into all the other ways that we conduct ourselves in this society. And this may seem like a small thing to some people. Oh, you only die once. You know, I've had people say, we only die once. What difference does it make? I don't know. You know, I was only born once too, but I'm hoping it made a difference. So I guess that's kind of where I come to with all of this work, is that we need to be seeing the way that we deal with death and the way that we deal with systems that are involved with death. And we need to be respectful of all the people and parts and all the machinery around it. But we need to do some real introspection as individuals, no matter what age you are, no matter where you're coming. I don't care about baby boomers and millennials and all that kind of stuff. Everybody's doing their part, particularly right now. And we're all finding ways to really think about why this matters and why we need to be having a larger worldview around it.
Well, we need to stop, and that's probably a great place to stop. And I loved what you just said. So very important. And clearly, I'd love to get you back on this program, because we could easily go on another hour. And I love kind of the repartee we've got here in terms of adding pieces and you've illuminated me about a few cool pieces. So I've been speaking with Lee Webster. Fabulous. Thank you so much. I not only appreciate hearing your words, I appreciate looking at you while you're speaking. So please take me up on my offer to come to our 3rd International Death Doula training on Maui, April 25th to the 29th, for all of you who also might want to join us. Please come, Lee, and I hope we can do this again.
Boy, that would be great. I've got a whole winter to fit into that bikini, right?
You do. You've got some time.
Okay, then.
You've got some time, Lee.
Great. Thanks, Bodhi. This is wonderful. I love talking with you.
Thank you, Lee. Lee Webster.
All right.
Great work. Okay. Aloha, Lee.
Bye.